The transport vessel Dividend Reach had been a perfectly functional ship right up until the moment it stopped being one. The transition from operational spacecraft to smoking wreckage happened with the kind of abrupt finality that left no room for dignified responses, just noise, terror, and the sensation of physics asserting itself in ways that violated several comfortable assumptions about atmospheric entry. When the shrieking stopped and the world returned to something resembling stable, Maren Keeley unbuckled herself from what remained of her crash webbing, tested each limb to confirm it still bent in the intended directions, and climbed out of the ruined hull into brilliant, unfamiliar daylight. Around her, chaos had achieved the specific texture that only mixed-species panic could produce. The Sarith navigator, Kelvis, was attempting to establish some form of command hierarchy while bleeding from a shallow cut across his scaled brow, his natural inclination toward structured authority doing battle with the fact that literally no one was listening. The Volan engineer, Thorne, had wedged herself halfway into an access panel, despite the panel being attached to nothing useful, her 4 arms working with mechanical precision on components that no longer connected to anything. 2 of the Krutal, Maren recalled their names as Dresh and Oki, were trying to stabilize their 3rd companion Pim, who'd taken a harder knock to the head and seemed dazed but mobile. The Ureni xenobiologist, whose name was an ultrasonic trill that most species rendered as Cephi, sat near a piece of torn bulkhead and catalogued every possible catastrophic outcome in a high-pitched, continuous stream of consciousness that would have been impressive if it weren't so thoroughly unhelpful. Maren stood at the edge of this tableau and performed the single most useful action available to her. She looked around at what was actually present rather than what was missing. The wreckage occupied a clearing near a river delta where water braided itself through sediment deposits in patterns that spoke of seasonal flooding and predictable behavior. Vegetation clustered thick along the banks, not the careful, cultivated greenery of settled worlds, but the opportunistic sprawl of plants that knew how to take advantage of consistent water and disturbed soil. The sky held a sun somewhat yellower than Earth's, but the light felt familiar enough. Gravity was close to standard. The air smelled of wet earth and crushed plant matter and the acrid bite of cooling metal. She walked toward the river, stepping over debris and ignoring Kelvis's attempt to get her attention. Whatever organizational system he wanted to implement could wait. Water couldn't. The riverbank offered a more interesting story than the wreckage. Maren crouched at the water's edge and watched the current. Not fast enough to be dangerous, but steady, a watercourse with depth and history. Sediment patterns suggested the river rose and fell on a predictable schedule, probably seasonal. She dipped her fingers into the flow and noted the temperature, cool but not cold, the way water felt when it came from somewhere with shade and stone. Upstream, she could see where the banks narrowed and the water darkened, hinting at depth. Downstream, the river spread wide and lazy across the delta before disappearing into what looked like forest. Along the immediate shoreline, several species of plant had established themselves in distinct zones. Closest to the water, something with thick fibrous stems and broad leaves that showed signs of being browsed by local fauna, edges torn, not cut, which meant teeth or beaks, rather than careful herbivory. Further back, a sprawling ground cover with small dense leaves and woody stems. Higher on the bank where flooding would be less frequent, taller vegetation with seed heads that rattled in the light breeze. Maren didn't touch anything yet. She just looked, building a mental catalogue of what grew where and why. A small creature, something like a 6-legged lizard with feathered scales, skittered across a rock and paused to drink from the river before darting into the underbrush. It moved with the confidence of something that wasn't currently dying of poison, which was a useful data point. Another creature, this one more insect than reptile, landed on one of the broad-leafed plants near the water and began methodically chewing holes in the foliage. Also not dead, also useful. She walked further upstream, studying the way plant distribution changed with minor elevation shifts, noting which species appeared healthy and which looked stressed. One particular cluster of plants growing in the shallows had thick, bulbous roots visible just below the water's surface, starchy, probably, given the structure. Potentially edible, if prepared correctly, though correctly would require testing that she wasn't prepared to do while standing knee-deep in an alien river with no backup plan. When she returned to the crash site, the argument had evolved but not resolved. Kelvis had convinced Thorne to stop disassembling non-functional components, but only by redirecting her toward the communications array, which was equally non-functional but at least looked purposeful. The Kratal had settled Pym into a sheltered spot and were now debating in their own language, a series of clicks and whistles that Marin's translator rendered as something about movement versus staying, which probably meant they were arguing about whether to leave the crash site. Sephi had stopped predicting doom long enough to start collecting small items from the wreckage, medical supplies, containers, anything that looked portable and potentially useful. That, at least, was practical. Marin surveyed the salvageable materials. Most of the ship's food stores had been in a compartment that was now compressed into something resembling abstract sculpture. The emergency rations had been in a locker that had ruptured during the crash, scattering sealed packets across 50 meters of terrain, and judging by the way several packets had split open, the local scavengers had already discovered them and rendered judgment. What remained were containers, some intact lengths of wiring, metal panels of various sizes, and the general detritus of a ship that had transitioned violently from aerospace vessel to stationary junk. Someone had managed to start a fire, which was more than Marin had expected, probably Dresh, who came from a world where fire was ceremonially significant and practically essential. The flames burned in a haphazard pile of dried plant matter and small wood, producing more smoke than heat, but it was a start. Marin selected a flat stone from near the river, water-smoothed, roughly the size of a dinner plate, and carried it back to the camp. She set it down near the fire without explanation. Then she returned to the wreckage and retrieved a metal panel that had once been part of the interior galley structure, along with several empty containers that had held medical supplies and a collection of river stones in graduated sizes that she'd noticed while walking the bank. She brought these items back to the fire and arranged them with deliberate care, the metal panel positioned where heat would reach it, the containers rinsed clean with river water, the stones placed in a ring that would retain and reflect warmth. Kelvis stopped mid-sentence in whatever he'd been saying to Thorne and stared at her. "What are you doing, making it possible to eat something other than panic?" Marin said. She was stripping fibers from some of the plant stalks she'd collected, testing their strength by pulling until they either held or snapped. Most snapped. A few held. "We need to establish communication protocols," Kelvis said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. Rescue procedures require us to be alive when rescue arrives," Marin said. She bent the metal panel carefully, testing where it would flex without breaking, working it into a crude basin shape. "That means water we can drink, and food that won't kill us. Everything else is secondary." Thorne's head emerged from the communications array. "The primary transceiver is fractured. The backup system's power cell is depleted. Even if I bypass then it's not getting fixed today," Marin said. "Which means today we focus on not starving." She positioned the metal basin over the fire, propped on stones, and added water from one of the containers. The water had come from the river, carried up in a container she'd rinsed 3 times to remove any residue from its former contents. It wasn't sterile, but boiling would handle most biological contaminants. Chemical contaminants were a different problem, one she'd address after establishing whether they could eat anything at all. She looked at the assembled crew, most of whom were now watching her with expressions ranging from confusion to irritation. I need specific things. Dried wood, small enough to feed the fire consistently. More containers, if you find them, cleaned with river water. Any fabric that's not completely shredded, I can use it for filtering. And if anyone sees plants with seed heads, the rattling kind about 200 meters downstream, bring me a sample but don't eat anything. No one moved immediately. Then Oki, one of the Kratal, stood and brushed dust from her legs. "I'll get wood," she said. Her language didn't translate emotion well, but her body language suggested pragmatic acceptance. Kratal valued contribution, doing the work that needed doing without excessive discussion about who was in charge of deciding what needed doing. Dresh joined her. "I'll help." Sefi, who had been vibrating with anxiety since the crash, seemed to find relief in having a specific task. "I can identify containers. I've been collecting them already. And my species has very sensitive chemical detection, if that's useful for." "It's extremely useful," Merrin said. "Come here." The Irini approached with the cautious energy of someone expecting to be told they'd done something wrong. Merrin handed her several plant samples, leaves, stems, a piece of root. "Smell these. Tell me if anything registers as caustic, toxic, or similar to compounds your species avoids." Sefi's whole demeanor shifted. She had a job that used her actual skills rather than just her capacity to worry. She took each sample carefully, her narrow face close to the plant matter, the small sensory organs around her nostrils flaring. "This one," she said, indicating a thick-leafed plant, "has something similar to, not exactly poison, but it would cause gastric distress in my species, probably irritant compounds." "Good," Merrin said. "That's out." She set the sample aside, well away from anything edible. "What about these?" They went through each sample. Some got flagged. Most didn't trigger any alarm. It wasn't a perfect system. Irini biochemistry wasn't universal, but it was better than nothing, and it gave Sefi something to do besides catastrophize. Thorn eventually extracted herself from the communications array and approached with the methodical curiosity of an engineer encountering an unfamiliar system. "You're attempting food preparation with no testing equipment, no chemical analysis, and no established safety protocols." "Correct," Merrin said. "That's dangerous." "Starvation is also dangerous," Merrin said. "I'm working on balancing risks." She explained her approach: observation of local fauna, cautious testing protocols, boiling for sterilization, starting with plants that showed signs of being part of the local food web. She didn't lecture or condescend. She just described the reasoning, laying it out like a technical problem with multiple variables and incomplete data. Thorn listened with the focused attention of someone translating this into her own frameworks. "You need standardized testing stages." "Yes." "And documentation of results." "Very much yes. I can create a cataloging system." Thorn's 4 arms moved in a gesture that suggested satisfaction, with proper notation for each stage of testing and observable outcomes. "That would be extremely helpful," Merrin said, and meant it. By the time the sun reached its apex, the camp had transformed from a collection of panicked individuals into something resembling a functional group. The fire burned steadier, fed with the wood Oki and Dresh had gathered. The water in Marin's improvised basin boiled steadily, steam rising into air that was warm but not oppressive. Sephi had assembled a collection of containers, sorted by size and condition. Thorne had begun documenting plant samples with systematic precision, using a piece of charred wood to mark notations on a salvaged panel. Kelvis, who had spent most of the morning trying to assert organizational authority that no one acknowledged, finally approached Marin with something resembling genuine curiosity. "You're a botanist. That's what my credentials say. And you're comfortable with this?" He gestured at the makeshift kitchen, the organized chaos, the collaborative work happening without formal command structure. "Comfortable isn't the word I'd use," Marin said. She was testing water temperature with her finger, waiting for the right moment to add the first batch of plant material, the tubers she'd noticed growing in the shallows, cleaned and cut into sections, but functional works. "Being stranded is a logistics problem. We need water, food, shelter, and not to kill each other, in that order. Most species establish hierarchy first," Kelvis said. "Clear command structure prevents conflict." Most species didn't spend their evolutionary history in small groups where everyone had to contribute or the whole group starved, Marin said. She added the tuber sections to the boiling water and watched them bob in the current. "Humans figured out pretty early that survival isn't about who's in charge. It's about whether everyone's willing to share the work and whether anyone notices where the food is." Kelvis's scaled brow furrowed in a way that suggested he was filing this information away for later consideration. He didn't argue, which Marin appreciated. The testing protocol she established was simple but non-negotiable. First exposure, skin contact, waiting for any reaction. Second exposure, lip contact, waiting for burning or numbness. Third exposure, small taste, no swallowing, waiting for adverse sensations. Fourth exposure, tiny amount swallowed, followed by a waiting period of several hours. Only after all stages passed without incident would something be approved for general consumption. It meant progress was slow. It meant rejecting several plants that might have been perfectly safe but triggered warning signs at early stages. It meant going to sleep hungry the first night because nothing had passed through all testing phases. But it also meant that when Marin woke on the second day and prepared the first meal using tubers that had been boiled until soft, everyone who ate that meal did so with the confidence that someone had been careful about keeping them alive. The kitchen area evolved organically. Marin cleared a space near the river where water access was convenient and flooding seemed unlikely based on the vegetation patterns. She used salvaged materials to create surfaces, flat panels propped on stones, containers arranged for storage, a washing station where river water could be used without contaminating the drinking supply. The other crew members contributed what they could. Thorne fabricated a crude grate from wiring, which allowed for more controlled cooking over the fire. Kelvis organized supply rotation with the precision of someone used to managing logistics across vast distances. Oki and Dresch built a smoke rack using green wood and salvaged struts, creating a structure where excess food could be preserved. What emerged wasn't impressive by any civilized standard. It was rough, improvised, held together with plant fiber cordage and hopeful engineering. But it worked. Marin established routines because routines created structure, and structure created calm. Morning, revive the fire from banked coals, prepare drinking water, assess food supplies. Midday foraging expedition, with at least 2 people together for safety. Evening, communal meal, fire maintenance, preparation for night. The routines weren't enforced through command. They simply made sense, and people fell into them naturally. The bickering didn't disappear entirely. Dresch and Oki argued about the best way to construct the smoke rack. Thorne insisted on documenting every plant sample with exhaustive detail that Sephi found unnecessary. Kelvis periodically attempted to implement formal organizational systems that everyone else ignored. But the arguments were about practical matters now: how much wood to collect, whether to try smoking fish, where to dig a proper latrine, not about fear and frustration and the existential terror of being stranded. The first real meal happened 6 days after the crash. Maren had spent the morning preparing everything she'd tested and approved. The starchy tubers, boiled until they achieved a texture somewhere between potato and cassava. Leafy greens that she'd wilted over hot stones after confirming they contained no obvious toxins. And a broth, her favorite discovery, made from simmering the stems of a riverside plant that released a surprisingly savory flavor when cooked, something almost like mushroom or aged cheese, though it was neither. She served portions as the sun dropped toward the horizon, the fire casting warm light across faces that represented 7 different evolutionary paths. The food wasn't elaborate, it wasn't delicious by most standards, but it was hot, it was safe, and it was offered to everyone simultaneously. The crew gathered not because protocol demanded it, but because the food was there, and eating alone suddenly seemed foolish. They sat on salvaged cushions or flat rocks or directly on the ground, and for the first time since the crash, conversation emerged that wasn't about survival logistics. Dresch mentioned that his homeworld had tubers similar to these, though they grew in volcanic soil rather than river sediment. Kelvis talked about navigating by river currents when his ship's systems had failed during his early career, how water always told you where you were if you knew how to listen. Sephi tentatively described her grandmother's cooking, something about fermenting plant stems to create a broth base that the whole family shared during ceremonial gatherings. Maren said very little. She tended the fire, adjusted the stones to maintain heat, and listened. The meal was doing its work, creating a moment where they weren't a crashed crew on an unknown planet, just people sharing food, and the small stories that made them individuals rather than representative species. Over the following days, the systems expanded. Maren showed Thorne how to maintain the sand filtration setup, layering materials to catch progressively smaller particles. She taught Oki and Dresch which plants regenerated quickly if harvested correctly, explaining the difference between stripping a resource and cultivating it. She collaborated with Sephi on fermenting certain fruits, partly for preservation, partly out of curiosity, and partly because the experiment accidentally produced something mildly alcoholic that improved morale considerably when shared in small quantities around the evening fire. Kelvis, who had initially resented the lack of formal command structure, found unexpected purpose in documentation. He created a recipe collection, noting which plants grew where, how they should be prepared, what combinations worked together. He approached it with the same precision he used for navigation charts, creating something that could be useful if rescue ever arrived, and other ships needed to know what was edible on this The camp developed rhythms that felt almost natural. People knew when to gather water, morning before the sun heated the containers, when to forage midday, when light was best for identifying plants, when to tend the fire, constantly in rotation, because letting it die meant starting over with friction and patience. Arguments still happened, but they were productive arguments about practical problems, not circular panic. Fish appeared in their diet after Dresch figured out how to construct traps using the fibrous plant stems and weighted stones. The first catch was celebrated with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for major victories. Maren showed everyone how to clean the fish properly, which parts to save, how to smoke the excess for later consumption. Nothing was wasted. Scales became fertilizer for the small cultivated patches where edible plants grew. Bones went into broth. Entrails went into the river downstream where they'd feed whatever aquatic scavengers existed in this ecosystem. One evening, perhaps 3 weeks after the crash, time had become somewhat fluid without reliable chronometers. Kelvis approached Maren as she worked near the fire. The light was fading, the kind of soft transition from day to night that encouraged contemplation. "I've been thinking about your approach," he said, settling onto a rock nearby. "When we first crashed, I assumed someone needed to take command. Establish hierarchy, create order from chaos. And now?" Maren asked. She was stirring something in the pot, a stew made from the day's forage, nothing fancy but substantial. "Now I'm trying to understand why your species' approach worked when mine didn't," Kelvis said. "You never asserted authority, you never demanded compliance. You just started doing things and everyone eventually participated." Maren considered the question while testing the stew's consistency. "Humans spent a very long time figuring out how not to starve," she said finally. "Most of our evolutionary history was small groups in environments that didn't care whether we survived. We learned early that survival isn't about who's in charge, it's about who notices where the food is and whether everyone's willing to share the work." She added a pinch of salt, actual salt, carefully harvested from evaporated tidal pools downstream, and continued. "Don't get me wrong, human history is full of elaborate hierarchies and territories and wars over who gets to decide things. We're perfectly capable of making everything complicated, but underneath all that noise, there's always been some practical person making sure there was dinner. Because kingdoms fall and empires collapse and command structures dissolve, but people still get hungry 3 times a day." Kelvis's head tilted in the gesture his species used for thoughtful agreement. "Your species prioritizes immediate survival needs over organizational structure. More like we recognize that organizational structure is only useful if everyone survives long enough to benefit from it," Maren said. "You can have the best hierarchy in the galaxy, but if nobody knows where to find drinking water, you're just well-organized corpses. That's remarkably pragmatic." "That's humanity," Maren said. "We're the species that looked at every hostile environment on our planet and thought, well, I bet we could eat something here. And then we usually could, because we were willing to watch and wait and try things carefully instead of assuming we already knew the answers." She served the stew, ladling portions into containers that had once held medical supplies and now served as bowls. The crew gathered as they always did now, drawn by habit and hunger and the simple comfort of shared meals. As Maren sat by the fire that evening, she watched her crewmates settle into their usual positions. Thorn and Sephi had developed an unlikely friendship based on their shared appreciation for systematic documentation, and they were currently debating the merits of different notation systems for recording plant growth patterns. Kelvis was updating his recipe documentation with the care of someone creating a navigational chart. Dresh, Oki and Pim were teaching each other phrases in their respective languages, something they did most evenings, finding humor in mispronunciations and the way certain concepts didn't translate cleanly. No one was talking about the crash anymore. No one was checking the broken communications array every hour, hoping it had miraculously repaired itself. They were just existing in this temporary place, using temporary solutions that worked well enough. Maren poked the fire, adding another log, watching sparks spiral into the darkening sky. She thought about humanity's long history of looking at disasters and making dinner anyway, about the practical stubbornness that had carried her species through ice ages and droughts and every environmental catastrophe that Earth had offered, about the way survival was always fundamentally about noticing what was actually present and figuring out how to use it, rather than mourning what was absent. She didn't share these thoughts aloud. The observation sat quietly in her mind, accompanied by the smell of cooking fish from tomorrow's meal prep and the sound of crew members who had stopped being strangers. They'd probably be rescued eventually. Someone would notice the dividend reach had gone missing, and search patterns would expand until this planet got checked. But in the meantime, they had water that was safe to drink, food that wouldn't kill them, shelter that kept the rain off, and routines that gave structure to their days. The fire crackled, sending another shower of sparks towards stars that were beginning to emerge in the deepening sky. The river flowed with its steady, predictable current, the same sound it had made yesterday and would make tomorrow. Somewhere downstream, fish moved through the water, following their own patterns and rhythms, unaware that they'd become part of a human's expanding understanding of this ecosystem. Marin adjusted the stones around the fire's edge, ensuring the heat would bank properly overnight, and accepted a container of stew from Sephi, who had taken it upon herself to ensure everyone actually ate, rather than getting too absorbed in their evening activities. The stew was warm and savory and entirely adequate, which was really all anyone could ask from a meal prepared with salvaged equipment on an uncharted planet. Tomorrow there would be more foraging, more testing of new plants, more refinement of the systems that kept everyone fed and healthy. Tomorrow Kelvis would probably suggest another organizational improvement that everyone would politely ignore. Tomorrow Thorn would discover some new way to optimize the filtration system. Tomorrow would be much like today, which was precisely the point. The greatest human talent had never been conquest or innovation, or any of the grand achievements that got recorded in history. It was the ability to look at a complete disaster and think, well, we still need to eat. Everything else, the art, the science, the elaborate civilizations, all of it came after someone figured out dinner. Marin finished her stew and set the container aside for washing in the morning. The fire burned steadily, tended by people who'd learned its rhythms. The river sang its endless song, and dinner, as it turned out, had been perfectly adequate, which was enough.